Well, thank you, Dave. And Dave is doing a great job heading the ERE program, but I might say last week I was at Los Alamos, and in a cruel statement by the lab director, he pointed out that I've had a long history of doing some research there, and pointed out that I was one of the few living people who still had a 0 at the head of my personnel number, highlighting my age. But Dave, on the other hand, is still ARPA E1, so it's really great. But actually, the other part of that story is that, as Dave said, he was at MIT. I knew him as a student, and Dave was really the driving force of also the MIT Energy Club, which is kind of the major, the biggest and most active graduate student, especially graduate students, it's broader, energy club. But as he said, he was a troublemaker, so when Secretary Chu called me and asked for some recommendations about who might help staff up ARPA-E, I was glad to recommend Dave, and he went down there, in fact, really helped stand that up. And now, I think what's very important, and we're working together on this, but bringing the ARPA-E spirit of innovation to ERE, which I think is really helping to also invigorate that program. I also will just add, without going through all the praise that the job Dan Arvizu is doing here is terrific, and without getting into details, I might add that I've had a little bit of history here as well in some recent years, talking about troublemakers. I think it fits into that. I also want to really acknowledge today meeting some of the industry partners. It's been very important. Tom, I do not drive a Prius, but Ben, I do send money every month to Excel from a little cabin in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. It's an automatic payment. You're right. It's always on time. Well, anyway, it really is a pleasure to be here. It's a very special day, and Madam Mayor and commissioners and colleague lab directors and others. I'll talk a little bit about ESIF, but first let me say, I think how ESIF and its program fits into the broader picture of, I think, our priorities at the Department of Energy over the next few years. Clearly, well, many of you know the department has got a complex set of missions, but focusing in on the energy and environment mission. First of all, there's no question what our script comes from the President's Climate Action Plan. On June 25th, the President stepped forward quite strongly in terms of stating our need to address the climate change risks. On my first day on the job, Dave said the new Energy Secretary, 3.5 months doesn't feel that new anymore. But I said then, I'm not here to debate what's not debatable. And what's not debatable is the fact that any prudent person would recognize that we need to start really getting more serious and accelerate our addressing climate change risks. There's plenty to debate in terms of how we do it, et cetera, but we need to move forward. And so the President put forward a plan that had really, of course, a strong mitigation approach, that is limiting greenhouse gas emissions and for the energy sector in particular CO2 emissions, but also recognized that we need to frankly acknowledge that we will be facing effects of climate change, even as we try to kind of beat the clock with mitigation. And so adaptation is another part of our responsibility. And may I say a few more words, but fundamentally I will argue that both the mitigation and the adaptation agendas are very, very much connected to the ESIF agenda that will be pursued here at NREL. And in fact, certainly in terms of the impacts here in the West, in Colorado, issues of wildfires, for example, increased wildfires, you all know, what that means. Again at Los Alamos last week, one of the science projects we saw was a very sobering look at what the western forests will look like if we do not address these issues. And of course on the East Coast, things like coastal surges, Sandy, made it very, very clear what the impacts can be, including maybe Mother Nature kind of pointing out that if we don't take care of our energy system, she will. So I think we learned some important lessons there. Now, in the mitigation agenda, I'll just say that at the department, of course, we have a number of activities. Certainly, efficiency is very important, and we are picking up the pace in terms of efficiency standards. But I'll just focus on, of course, what has been I'll also add, of course, as was said, the president, and I'm very much aligned, clearly, does have a all of the above strategy, but I want to make clear what that means is that within the commitment to lower CO2 emissions, our job is also to try to develop the technologies and the options for all of our energy sources to be competitive, or at least to have a shot at competition in a future low-carbon marketplace. But of course, for a long time, and NREL, as Dave pointed out, has been certainly core to this. We've had as a core program the issue of developing some of the zero-carbon technologies that are going to be part of the future. I thought it would be useful to just, I think if we have some slides potentially, does somebody have slides to put up there? Great. I just wanted to point out for 4 key technologies, wind, PV, LEDs, and batteries for electric vehicles, sometimes maybe we don't kind of appreciate what's actually happened over the last years. You take wind. In each case, there'll be essentially a cost metric, and it goes down quite a lot. And there's a deployment metric, how many units are deployed, and it goes up very, very fast. And I think, you know, the kind of the message is that I think a lot of us, even those of us in this community, still have this lingering idea that, you know, these technologies are always 5 years away or 10 years away. Now, we hear about great deployment here and electric vehicles and very efficient supercomputers. But I think it's worth looking, you know, I mean, I'm not going to go through the numbers, but the wind story. I mean, is this now becoming a material issue? Well, wind was the most capacity deployed last year was wind. It was number 1. If we turn to solar, a similar kind of story. Is it becoming material? Well, as we discussed in a meeting earlier, certainly if you look at the discussions going on in many states in the country in terms of the issues of solar and net metering and the challenges to traditional utility models, that sounds pretty material to me when these issues have to be addressed. We go to LEDs. LEDs are next, I hope. Yes. Here again, the story is that tremendous cost reduction, $50 to $15 in a very, very short period, and consequently 20 million now deployed and going up incredibly fast, with $100 plus savings, lifetime savings for one bulb. I mean, this is you know, this is getting material. And finally, if we go to the battery chart, again, a substantial reduction. We clearly have more to go for, you know, a longer range. I think Toyota would endorse the idea that to get, you know, a purely electric, certainly longer range vehicle, we have a ways to go. But the fact is, we may hit 100,000 electric vehicle sales this year. We've had things like Tesla called, you know, the best car ever reviewed, et cetera. We really are, I think, at the threshold of these becoming very material contributors to our system. So we made a lot of progress there. Not enough. Still, we're going to keep working with our strong technology programs in the department here at NREL and of course in industry as well. But now, if we look forward, the issue is now the challenge of integration, and that brings us here to ESIF. We have many demands now that will be placed on a system, partly driven by the success and continued success of those technologies. So, renewables integration, distributed generation integration is clearly important, and that is going to require continuing to put more intelligence into the grid and predictions of, as Ben said, in terms of understanding the renewable resource, et cetera. But I just want to say that there's many more demands that will be placed on that energy system of the future than just that. There will be the provision of new consumer services, integration of IT. There will be continuing reliability issues. Very important, something that, again, Sandy certainly helped bring home, resilience. We need to build an energy system of the future that accomplishes all the above, plus is resilient to natural, if you call it natural, like hurricanes. They're natural, but natural events, extreme weather events, but also to cybersecurity, another enormously growing challenge. So we need to think about a new architecture that accomplishes, it's kind of an all-of-the-above architecture, need a vision for where we're going 10, 20 years down the road, so that it guides our decisions tomorrow and the day after tomorrow about what do we do in terms of technology, what do we do in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, in terms of resolving all the issues we need for a functioning, very complex energy system. In fact, another issue I would just add, again, an issue which came to the fore in Sandy, is when I say energy system, I do mean energy system and not just electricity system. In fact, in Sandy, again, we got a lesson in terms of the intersection of multiple energy infrastructures and how they can come together, and when one goes down, a lot of other things can go down and very, very, very much complicate the recovery. So at the Department of Energy, I would just want to say that over the next, certainly I can assure you for the next 3.5 years at least, this issue of looking at the energy systems is going to be a major focus. I think, while we continue the technology, this is kind of the step out that we need, a much elevated focus on energy systems integration. ESIF is one important part of that program, and it's certainly why I'm so pleased to be here today to help inaugurate it. Now, we also saw, and I want to recognize that part of that are the tools, and again, we've heard already about Peregrine, and I guess I was at least the honorary booter-upper of Peregrine, and that's great. I mean, operating at petascale, or 10 to the 15th operations per second, and to have a capability of that scale dedicated specifically to these issues around energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy integration, is really a step forward again for the department. The Department of Energy has historically been a major driver of the leading edge of large-scale computation in this country. Historically, that was driven principally by the weapons program, and in my last go-around, at DOE. In fact, that was the petascale epoch, and it was driven by the weapons program. Towards the end of my tenure, we emphasized, however, that this needed to really be applied much more aggressively on the energy and science side of the agenda. That eventually led to the establishment of the Office of Advanced Computation. And I'm pleased to say today, as we look forward, not backwards to terascale, but forward to exascale, that frankly, it's a partnership between our weapons program and our science energy programs, but the latter is actually leading it. So I think it's really important that has come to pass. I'll also add that the technology advancement here in terms of having such an efficient system is going to be really important for the exascale. We don't need to have one small modular reactor to operate every computer. And so we're looking for order of magnitude energy reductions to get to this scale. So that's a very important part of our strategy, this energy integration. A third part of the strategy then is that as we have the technologies and we have a handle around the energy integration issues, that we also need to see how is it that we can help get these things out there to actually help move our energy system. And there we start with in terms of our priorities, a clear recognition that an awful lot of the innovation in terms of the policy world and a lot of the action and a lot of the responsibility comes at the state level. We have some people here, to the state commissioners, so we are upping our game in terms of our ability to work with the states and provide assistance as we can. The tools that we develop in ESIF, the tools that we develop through analysis, will be part of what we have to offer to the states. And one of your own, Alice Madden, who is here somewhere, way in the back, waiting to escape. Many of you may know Alice, former majority leader here in the state legislature, with other parts to her checkered background, has joined us less than a month ago to head up, in fact, our intergovernmental outreach push there. And so that's going to be another part of our strategy around the whole energy system approach. So I'm going to move towards closing these remarks, but I want to mention one more important thrust at the department, and that is that with all of this in mind, we have stood up a new organization called the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Organization, and I do want to emphasize the systems analysis part. It's headed by Melanie Kenderdine, who is another part of the back of the room. There seems to be a habit at DOE. It just shows that they all feel they have to escape quickly in Washington. Well, not in Washington, it's okay. You can be calmed down. Anyway, so this is a major organization for us. It will do a lot of things, but included in that they will be the muscle for what is called a quadrennial energy review. That was also announced in the President's Climate Action Plan. It's going to be an interesting and challenging process in which we have to bring together many agencies across the administration, all of whom have different equities in the energy issues, to come together for a coherent action plan. In this next year and a half, in the President's Action Plan, it stated that this initial year and a half focus will be energy infrastructure. So again, it's right at the heart of the issue that we are talking about. And so in Melanie's shop, among other things, building up an analytical capability, also a state and local focus, and that will be a partnership in terms of developing the tools at ESIF, in analysis, in outreach, so that hopefully we can move the system in this way. I will say, last comment perhaps, is that in doing all of this, including the analysis and the quadrennial energy review, our laboratories will play a very central role. And I want to acknowledge Dan in particular and his colleagues, but Dan for really helping pull together what has been a multi-laboratory set of inputs to how this quadrennial energy review will be shaped. So these are our partners, and I think that this new focus on systems and getting it out, getting our capabilities at the service as well of the states as well, I think will be, again, it's going to be a major focus of DOE, and I hope it's going to really help us transform the energy system to the one that we need in 2030 that has all the attributes that we discussed earlier. So with that, I'm going to be looking forward to the progress, And I want to congratulate everybody here for their contributions to this new capability. Thank you, Dan.